Hey there folks, welcome to video 3 of chapter 2. This is the wrap-up video for chapter 2. If this is your first video for chapter 2, back it on up, start at the very beginning for this chapter. For those of you who've been following along, come with me. So we were just talking about how to make water, how do hydrogen bonds bind with oxygen atoms and bind two hydrogens per one oxygen, making a water molecule. And that's the physics of how to make a water molecule. But let's talk about some of water's properties that make it so important biologically. I mean, biology is what we're here to study, right? Biologically and chemically speaking, water is intensely important. Water has so many different properties that make it intensely useful. And very, very powerful in a biological setting. See, those hydrogen atoms that bind ever so easily to oxygen bind just as easily with everything else. And this means that the presence of those hydrogen bonds in water give water a property called cohesion. And it means that water molecules tend to stick together. Now, generally speaking, molecules of the same kind tend to show a certain amount of cohesion, but water shows it very well. This is why when you see water droplets, like up here on these, the water droplets on this spider web, you can see the water binding together, sticking together. It's no different than water droplets sitting on the palm of your hand will tend to kind of clump together as opposed to spreading out in a thin, even layer all over your hand. Water also has an adhesive property, which means that it will stick to other things like a thin layer of it will stick to your hand if you turn your hand upside down, or these water droplets sticking very well to the spider's web. Yes, the spider's web may be sticky, but that's not the property that's making the water stay. Those water droplets are big enough to be heavy enough you'd think they would fall off relative to the size of the spider web. It is water's adhesive property that makes a dew-dotted spider web possible, let alone that beautiful. Another property that water has because of the way it's built is surface tension. If you've ever been out to a pond or a lake, you might see a leaf floating on it, or even better, teeny tiny little insects that are so small they can actually skate across the surface of the water. Water has a certain amount of surface tension. It's related to cohesion, water's ability to stick to itself, that makes it difficult to a certain measure to bend or break the surface of a liquid. The hydrogen bonds in water give it an unusually high surface tension, which make things possible, like that leaf floating along, or that insect skating across the surface. Water is also very important for temperature moderation. So those are just physical properties that make water very important. This is a chemical one. We use, as living things, we use water for evaporative cooling. This is what your sweat is. We're certainly not the only species that does so. This is a very, very common way of cooling down any living animal body. When our bodies are too hot, when we have all this excess body heat, maybe because we've been running or we've been very active, for one thing, we sweat, but we also lose water as water vapor, and both of these serve to help cool down our body temperature. When that water evaporates off of our body, it takes some heat energy with it in order to evaporate, and this is part of what helps us cool down. Another property of water that's very interesting is the way it changes how it's organized when it freezes. Generally speaking, when you compare a solid to a liquid, in the liquid, there's less structure between the atoms, as you can see here on the right. In a solid, like here on the left, atoms will bond to each other and molecules will bond to each other and they'll form a stable structure. something dense enough that you can knock on it, say like you would knock on a wall or on your desk. You can lean on it, you can apply pressure, and it doesn't give that easily. A liquid, however, does not have this structure. All of the molecules are just running around, bouncing against each other, and they don't maintain a set structure, which is why liquid acts the way it does. You cannot pour a solid. Its structure is too stable. It won't move. You can pour a liquid. It doesn't have a set, stable group structure. It will move. When water freezes, because of the angles that the water molecules form next to each other, when they find that stable structure as a solid, water takes up much more space as ice than it does as liquid water. Because it takes up so much space, but because it has so much extra space inside the structure, see those large gaps in the crystalline structure of ice versus how compact liquid water is, this is what makes ice float. That phenomenon right there is what makes our polar ice caps possible. Water is also what we call the universal solvent. It is the solvent of life. Again, those hydrogen bonds that let it bind to itself so easily make water able to break apart and bind to practically anything else it encounters. So when, say, you add salt to water to make salt water, the hydrogen bonds will break off of their associated oxygen atoms, so the water will come apart, and it will bind to bits and pieces of the sodium and the chloride in sodium chloride or table salt. And this is what makes the sodium chloride dissolve in water. When we talk about a situation like this, there are some terms you should know. A solution is what happens when you have a substance that is dissolving in a liquid. In that situation, the liquid is the solvent. The thing that is dissolved is the solute. When we start applying that play back and forth between water and its parts, we can also start playing around with the pH scale. When water comes apart, it comes apart into a positive hydrogen atom, just one floating by itself, and a negative OH group or hydroxide group. Because of the shift in electrical charges, atoms, molecules, and substances that have a high concentration of just free-floating hydrogen, these are called acids, and they are very, very good at binding to and mixing with other components and breaking them down because that free hydrogen binds like crazy. On the other end of the scale, substances that have a lot of negative hydroxide groups are also good at binding, but in different ways because those hydroxide groups have a negative charge. Fairly neutral substances that you can use to level out a pH scale are called buffers. The pH scale measures the relative concentration of free-floating hydrogen atoms. You can measure it a number of different ways, but most commonly we use pH paper, which changes color when you expose it to a substance of a specific pH. Things that are neutral, like most buffers, like classically water, tend to be in the orange to green-yellow range. Strong acids tend to be red or pink. Strong bases on the other end tend to be purple or blue. This comes in useful in some of the ways we use water in research. Here on Earth, we look at things like the long period acidification of the ocean as more and more water pollution ends up in our open water. Up in the upper right, you can see some tiny, tiny shells of very small organisms named pteropods. Because of changing ocean pH, you can see what happens to these shells over time. They start out looking very lovely and glassy, but over time they become warped and melted, broken down, because the water that they are floating in the ocean is becoming too acidic. Likewise, on a much larger scale, the same thing is happening to lots of our coral reefs. On a large scale, coral looks very tough, craggy, even prickly and strong, but it's created by very small, delicate organisms, and they cannot withstand a very large pH change in their surrounding water. And ocean acidification is also killing off a lot of our uh, coral reefs. The Great Barrier Reef itself, in fact, in any one point, is suffering about 2/3 loss. We need to try and protect it as much as we can, so it'll be there for us and our children to see someday. Far away from home, on the final frontier, yes, we're geeks, we'll borrow the line, you bet we will. Acid pressure and water presence, acid concentration, and the water patterns on the surface of Mars, those distinctive patterns that, say, end up getting left at the bottom of a riverbed or an ocean bed, lead to the belief that there may at one time have been water on the surface of Mars, and that there may yet be somewhere. So, either at home or far afield, water is one extremely important little molecule. That wraps it up for Chapter 2, folks. I'll see you next time.